In this lesson, we'll learn how to control both the placement of objects and perspective planes with precision. Alright, so in the previous lesson we learned a couple of different basic workflows for getting objects into perspective. We learned how to use some different tool sets and draw those objects right onto the different planes in our perspective grid. And we also learned how to grab flat objects that maybe we created before we enabled the perspective grid and move them onto that perspective grid. So I'll tell you what here, if we move over to the scratch area to the right, you can see here some basic orthographic drawings that I've created. And you know, in thinking about perspective drawing, I immediately think about architecture. So I chose to go ahead and select sort of a skyscraper here that we're going to be building for the rest of this course. And in looking at this skyscraper, you can see that I didn't go with sort of a traditional box shape. I wanted to go with something a little more unique that's going to present some interesting challenges to draw in perspective. So I picked sort of a triangular shaped building here. Now let's just kind of explore this for just a moment. If we look here at sort of the side view of our building, we've got here these vertical strips of light gray, sort of in these three areas right here. When I was designing this building, I thought initially that these would be sort of protrusions off the main body of the building. Now, if we look here at these protrusions, you can see in the front view, we've established the depth of those based on these shapes right here, along these two vertical strips. Now, these light shapes would represent the faces here that are at an angle, and these darker shapes right here would represent sort of this inside edge right here of each of these shapes. So we've got some different information here we're going to be working from. And I tell you what, let's go ahead and grab these three vertical shapes here first by holding down Shift and clicking each one of them. And I'm going to go ahead and make a copy by holding Alt and just drag that over close to our perspective grid here. And we need to go ahead and get these three flat objects into perspective. So I tell you what, we're going to grab our perspective selection tool using Shift V, and we're going to go ahead and just click on these three objects here, and we're going to move those over onto our grid. Now, I do have my Snap to Perspective Grid option turned on. You can find that under the View drop-down menu, and look under Perspective Grid, and it's going to make positioning those according to the grid lines here a lot easier. We can snap those to the established cells. And I tell you what, let's go ahead and talk about this cluster of objects, or these three objects we have selected here. Now, we can see here there's a bounding box, and let's just say we want the bottom right corner of these three objects to sit right on our origin right here, right at the 0, 0 point for our X and Y axes. So how could we do that? Well, being that that's the origin and it sits on these grid lines, we could use our Snap to Grid feature and just hold down Shift. Well, let me go ahead and select all three of these objects here. And we could just grab all three of them and slide them along and snap them to that X-axis here. And you can see that because the 0, 0 sits on grid lines, we can snap to that here. Now, how do we know that we've got that right on the 0, 0 axis? Well, we use the Transform panel. Now, you can access the Transform panel through the Control panel up here at the top, this little blue hyperlink right here, or you can come over here under the Window drop-down menu and choose Transform. All right, great. So we've got that open here. And you can see here that according to our X and our Y values, they're both set to 0. So we know that we're sitting on the origin with that corner. Now, how do we know that it's measuring from that corner? We know that because of the reference point. Now, if you're working along with me at home, then you may notice that your reference point is probably set to this top left-hand corner. That's the default reference point here in Illustrator. Now, if you want to, you can simply just click on that bottom reference point, or that bottom right corner, changing the reference point for these three objects. Therefore, we can line that up exactly with our origin here. Now, let's say for a minute you're doing sort of a technical drawing. Maybe you're building an object based on blueprints or schematics, and you need to know exact positions for objects. So this is actually going to be really helpful for precise placement of your objects in perspective. Let's say we wanted to move these three objects back 100 points on the X-axis. All we have to do is come up here and enter a -100 into the X field and hit enter, and we can slide those three objects back exactly -100 points. Now, that just happens to be sitting on this grid line, but let's say we wanted a little different value. Maybe instead of -100 points, it's -108 points. We can exactly position these objects anywhere we want to using this Transform panel. Now, we could also move them up the Y-axis as well. Let's go ahead and say we want to set this to 108 points on the Y-axis. You can see that we can move that up. Now, again, you can enter negative values here, moving the objects down below. But for this lesson, I want to go ahead and set this to 0, 0. We'll make sure and get rid of that minus 108 there. Alright, great. So we've got these objects sitting exactly on our origin. Now, in the previous lesson, we learned how we could make a copy of an object and move it perpendicular to the original, moving it what seems to be back in space here. Now, let's say, looking at these three protrusions, if these are indeed protruding from the side of this building, then we're going to see a little bit of depth here. So we need to establish another plane here for the back side where these protrusions sit flush up against our building. Well, that's actually pretty simple to do. Again, in the previous lesson, we learned how to hold down Alt and 5 to make a copy of an object and move it in a perpendicular fashion. Now, the problem with this is that we can't place it necessarily with precision when we let go of it. Now, we could try and select those three pasted objects and manipulate them with the transform panel, but let me show you an easier way to do that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to know exactly how wide these protrusions are. So for that, I'm going to come back over to my orthographic drawing here, and we're going to go ahead and just select on one of these objects on the side here, because this will tell us what the depth of that protrusion is. I'm going to hold down Control and just select one of those, and you can see here that according to our transform panel, the width of that object is 0.1703 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and select that and copy it with a Control-C. And let me go ahead and come back over to our perspective grid now. We'll deselect that now that we have that value copied. So now this is really important. Now remember, when I set up this grid, I specified a scale of 1 to 1, meaning 1 unit of measure on our perspective grid is equal to that same unit of measure in real life. Now if your perspective grid has a different scale setting, you're going to have to do some math here. So just fair warning when you do this next step. If it doesn't come out looking exactly like mine, keep in mind you may have the scale set to something besides 1, 1. So I tell you what we're going to need to do is we're going to basically need to move this left grid plane back that specified distance so we can create this new plane. Now, how do we move the grid plane a specified distance? Well, that's really simple. All we need to do is come down here and double click on our grid plane widget. So let's go ahead and double click on that left grid plane widget, and we're going to access this left vanishing point dialog. So in this dialog, we can specify an exact location for our plane, and I'm going to do that by pasting in my value. So let me hit Control-V, and you can see we've pasted in that value. Now we've got some other options here down here for the objects that sit on this plane. What are we going to do with these objects? Are we going to not move them and just move the grid plane itself? Are we going to move all of the objects? Or are we going to copy all of the objects? I tell you what, before I do this, I just noticed a little bit of a problem. It looks like something may have got shifted here, so let me go ahead and cancel this dialog for just a moment. I'm going to look here at this third column, and let me just come in and take a look here. What do we got going on with this? Yeah, it looks like that got shifted off of our x-axis just a little bit. So I tell you what, let me go ahead and move this and set the 0 point for the y to 0. Just move that down, snapping it into position. All right, so now I'm going to come back in here and again double click on my grid plane adjustment widget here. So we'll paste in our value, and with these three objects, I'm going to go ahead and copy them all to the new position of our plane. So you can see I'm going to click on this copy all objects bullet, and you may have noticed that the value that we pasted into our location has been converted to points for us. So that's okay. We're going to go ahead and hit OK now. And I tell you what, it may be kind of hard for you to see, but we've now got a copy, an exact copy at this new location. So I tell you what, let me come in and change the color of these so you can see those. I'm going to double click on the group of objects here and go into isolation mode, and we'll just make that a shade darker. And you can see already that we've got, again, a stacking order problem. So Illustrator, again, it's not smart enough to know that the stacking order needs to change, but we'll go ahead and make the adjustment to color here, and then we'll send all these to the back. So I'm going to double click on this one as well. Drill down into this gray shape. Alright, so we've got all of these changed. I'm going to go ahead and shift click on all three of these new shapes and go ahead and hit Control Shift open bracket to send them to the back. And let's just deselect those here. Zooming in here, you can see exactly what we've done. We've specified that exact depth of these three protrusions off of our main building here. Now, you may be wondering, let me switch back to the perspective selection tool. How are we going to get this perspective grid plane back to the 0, 0 point? Well, that's really simple. All we need to do now is double click on this again and enter a value of 0 for the location. and we can adjust that back to its original position through our origin. Alright, so hopefully you can see exactly how beneficial the transform panel can be, especially when you're looking to precisely move objects or even perspective grid planes. Now, in between lessons, go ahead and practice using the transform panel to move objects around your perspective grid planes. Also practice making copies of your planes and really get used to this sort of workflow, because we're only going to build on this from here on out. So in the next lesson, we'll pick up where we're leaving off here, and we'll learn how to automatically position our planes.